Good morning, everyone. Our group will be presenting an intercultural communication analysis of Legend of 1900. The film follows Danny Booming T.D. Lemon 1900, who is usually called simply 1900. He is born and grew up on a ship called the SS Venation and never have a natural life on land. Since the ship often travels between Europe and America, 1900 meets wealthy passengers, migrants, workers, musicians, and people from many different backgrounds. This makes the film highly relevant to intercultural communication. Although the story does not mainly focus on obvious language barriers between national groups, it shows that intercultural difference can also emerge through identity, migration, social class, power, novel communication, and different interpretation of the same environment. Our central, this is the Legend of 19,000, portrays intercultural communication as a negotiation of meeting the identity within unique cultural spaces. In other words, the film shows that people many occupy the same physical environments but still understand freedom, belonging, status, and uncertainty in very different way. Our analysis mainly applies these three theoretical frameworks. The first is the interpretive approach, which examines how people create meaning through symbols, iteration, and context. The second is the critical approach, which focuses on power, inequity, and the fact that not all groups have equal opportunity to make their voice heard. And the third is beauty, comes anxiety, and uncertainty management theory, or AUM theory, which helps explain how people respond to unfamiliar cultural environments. We also use supporting concepts such as identity, negotiation, avowal, and ascription, novel communication, cultural space, therapy, and cultural adaptation. I will now pass the presentation to Sam for our first argument.
I will begin with our first argument, which concerns cultural identity. Our first argument is that the film challenges the idea that cultural identity is determined only by nationality. 1900 has no conventional national identity. He's born on a ship, raised by a ship worker, and never develops an ordinary relationship with a country or homeland. However, this does not mean that he has no culture. His identity is shaped through repeated experiences, relationships, music, and the routines of the ship. He understands its movement, its social environment, and its informal rules. The ship therefore becomes a cultural space in which his identity develops. This can be analyzed through the interpretive approach because identity gains meaning through interaction and context. A particularly useful concept is the distinction between avowal and ascription. Avowal refers to how individuals define and present themselves. 1900 expresses himself through music, through his attachment to the ship, and through his refusal to accept the assumption that a meaningful life must take place on land. Ascription refers to the identities imposed by other people. Others describe him as a genius, an entertainer, an eccentric person, or simply someone who should leave the ship and live normally. The conflict becomes particularly clear when Max tries to persuade 1900 to leave. Max generally wants to help him, but Max also assumes that life on land is the correct or normal future. 1900 does not share this interpretation. The giveway scene is especially significant when 1900 begins walking towards land, but eventually stops and returns to the ship. He's not simply changing his travel plans. Leaving will require him to reconstruct his identity in a complete unfamiliar environment. Therefore, the film demonstrates that cultural identity is not simply inherited through nationality. It can also develop through communication, relationships, memory, and attachment to space. Our second argument is that nonverbal communication plays a central role in how characters make connection and understandings. Nonverbal communication includes elements such as facial expression, gaze, posture, movement, silence, and the use of space. The Legend of 1900 forms of communication are particularly important because 1900 often communicates through music and bodily behavior rather than direct verbal explanation. One important example is the moving piano scene. During Raphael, the 1900 releases the piano and allows it to move across the ballroom while he plays. Max initially appears frightened and physically unstable. His body indicates uncertainty because he cannot predict what is happening. In contrast, 1900 appears calm and confident. His relaxed posture shows that he's familiar with the movement of the ship. As the scene develops, Max gradually participates. The two characters do not build trust through a long verbal conversation. Instead, they develop understanding through shared movement and experience. From the interpretive approach, this is important because the meaning of the situation depends on context. Max, the uncontrolled piano, initially represents danger. To 1900, the same situation is familiar and manageable. The second example is the recording scene. When 1900 notices the young woman while playing, his gaze, stillness, and change in musical expression communicate emotion without a direct conversation. Music becomes a form of non-verbal meaning. However, the scene also demonstrates that meaning is not always transferred perfectly. Another listener will hear the recording, but may not understand the exact personal experience that inspired it. The Gangway scene provides another strong example. Before 1900 fully explains his fear of the limitless city, his body already communicates uncertainty. He stops, looks at the city, and turns back. This can also be linked to expectancy violation theory. Other people would normally expect someone who has prepared to ship to continue walking towards land. When the hunter suddenly turns back, his behavior violates the expectation and may be judged as irrational. Overall, the film shows that body language is not secondary to spoken communication. Gaze, posture, silence, and movement activities shape how characters understand one another. Our third argument is the most important misunderstanding in the film are not caused by different languages. Instead, they arise because characters interpret the same ideas through different experiences. This can be analyzed through the interpretive approach. The clear example is the disagreement between Max and Andy Hunter about leaving the ship. Max sees land as the obvious location of future life. To him, leaving the ship means survival, opportunity, and freedom. However, 1900 interprets the same situation differently. The ship is the only environment he fully understands. Therefore, ideas such as freedom, future, and possibility do not carry the same meaning for both characters. This is an important example of intercultural misunderstandings because both characters speak the same language. The communication problem is not a vocabulary. The problem is that they interpret the word through different frames of experiences. A similar contrast appears in relation to America. For many migrants, arrival may represent hope and transformation. For 1900, the city represents an overwhelming number of possibilities. Therefore, the film demonstrates that one place can carry different cultural meanings depending on a person's history and a social position. This argument also relates to stereotyping. When people reduce 1900 to labels such as eccentric, cowardly, or strange, they risk ignoring the context that explains his behavior. Likewise, characters such as Morton can be reduced too quickly to labels such as arrogant. The interpretive approach encourages us to move beyond simple labels and ask how meaning is constructed. I will now pass the presentation to Tian San, who will explain how social class and power affect communication between people on the SS Virginia.
Thank you, Samir. Our fourth argument is that intercultural communication on the SS Virginia is shaped by class inequality and power. The ship brings different groups together, but they do not interact under equal conditions. Wealthy first-class passengers occupy elegant space associated with comfort and prestige. Poorer migrants travel under different material conditions and are often presented collectively. Workers and musicians perform service roles that support the experience of others. This can be analyzed through the critical approach, which examines how social and economic structures determine whose voices are valued. The physical designs of the ship communicates here which, even before anyone speaks, clothing, architecture, access to particular space and service rules all operate as signs of status. It is important not to mistake this inequality for simple cultural preference. The poorer circumstances of migrants are not evidence that they naturally prefer hardship. Their experiences are shaped by economic and structural conditions. The film also raises questions about representation. Wealthy passengers often receive more individual visibility, while migrants frequently appear as a collective group representing movement, hope, or displacement. This suggests a subtle form of inequality. Some characters are allowed complex individual stories, while others remain background figures. Even 1900 occupies a contradictory position. Institutionally, he has little form status because he lacks ordinary documentation. However, when he performs at the piano, his talent gives him symbolic authority and attracts the attention of elite passengers. Therefore, the film demonstrates that intercultural communication cannot be separated from power. People may share the same physical environment while still having unequal opportunities to define what the environment means. Our fifth argument focuses on the piano duel between 1900 and Jelly Roll Morton. At first, the scene appears to be simply a competition between two musicians. However, from an intercultural perspective, it is also a struggle over identity, prestige, and cultural authority. Morton enters with strong confidence and presents himself as an important authority within jazz. His identity is communicated not only through words but also through posture, eye contact, silence, and performance. The interpretive approach helps explain how the duo becomes a symbolic interaction. Each musical performance communicates a claim about competence, legitimacy, and status. However, the critical approach is also necessary. It would be too simple to describe Morton only as arrogant or ethnocentric. Jazz has deep connections with African American cultural history. Therefore, Morton's claim to authority exists within a broader historical context. The film creates an important tension. 1900 is influenced by the transatlantic environment and creates something new, but Morton represents a musical tradition with a specific cultural history. This raises questions about cultural ownership. Can a culture from thrive and change across different contexts? Yes, but should its historical origins be ignored? No. Therefore, the duel is not merely about who plays better. It demonstrates how cultural forms can become sites where identity, prestige, recognition, and historical authority are negotiated. Our sixth argument concerns 1900's refusal to leave the ship. This thing can be analyzed through Gutkunst, anxiety and uncertainty management theory, or AUM theory. AUM theory explains that intercultural adjustment partly depends on how people manage anxiety and uncertainty in unfamiliar environments. For 1900, the ship is predictable. He understands its routines, movement, and social environment. His musical identity is also recognized there. Land is completely different. It represents an unfamiliar cultural system containing countless roles, social roles, and possibilities. When 1900 stands on the gangway and looks at the city, his anxiety is connected to uncertainty about how to function and who he will become. Importantly, our analysis does not simply describe him as having high uncertainty avoidance. That concept generally refers to broader social patterns. AUM theory is more appropriate because it focuses on how an individual responds to ambiguity in an unfamiliar environment. The film also creates a paradox between freedom and constraint. The ship is physically limited, yet 1900 experiences artistic freedom within it. The city is physically open, yet its limitless possibilities make him feel constrained. This challenges the assumption that more choice always creates more freedom. However, the film should not completely romanticize his refusal to adopt. Intercultural competence often requires some willingness to tolerate ambiguity and revise expectations. Therefore, 1900's tragedy is not simply that he fears land, it is that his identity has become so connected to one environment that transition becomes almost impossible. I will now pass the presentation to Zhang Chenyi for our conclusion.
Thank you, Tianshan. To conclude, our analysis shows that the language of 1019 presents intercultural communication as much more than introduction between different nationalities. The film demonstrates that identity is no got through communication. That novel behavior creates important control more me, and the people then misunderstand one another even when they speak the same language. It also shows that in intercolonial cultures are shaped by union power. The different experience of wealthy passengers, matters, workers, and musicians demonstrates that sleepy bringing different groups together does not long-term conflict produce electronic. Through the interparliamentary approach, we examined how creators create me differently. Through the continuous approach, we examine the power, class, and continue visibly. Through AUM, the way analyzes the 1090s difficultly imagine archetypes when confronting life beyond the ship. As a group, our main learning is that interventional competes reveals us to question our first aspiration. Behavior that appears irrational may make sense within another person's face. Does not always create shared me, and the matched environment may still contain incorrectly. Ultimately, the language of 1019 teaches us that effective communicate refuse to identify context, history, and power. Thank you for listening.